Hello. One of the questions that comes up, fairly common in the space world, is a question about why don't we just rebuild the Saturn V? We had this wonderful rocket we used for the moon program, and why aren't we using that now? And the answer to that usually involves some discussion about technical things. The Saturn V was built in the 70s. We don't even have some of the plans anymore. It would be really hard to rebuild. All of those sort of things. And those are true, but there's this little bit of history, fairly recent history, that shows that maybe that wouldn't have been true. So that's what this talk is about, kind of exploring maybe an alternate history that could have happened. Now to start, we have to hop back about 10 years to 2010 and kind of discuss what was going on then. And at that point, shuttle was still flying. The program was getting ready to stop, but shuttle was still flying. And the US was working on a program known as Constellation. And Constellation was part of a bigger project to go back to the moon and to do more exploration and maybe go to Mars. And it had two different rockets. It had on the left, which is what is called the Ares 1, and on top of that it has the Orion capsule, and then on the right we have the Ares 5. And both of these are shuttle-derived rockets. So you think you take shuttle components and you kind of put them together in a different format, and you end up with these two solutions. And that is what we had. And then in 2010, we had an investigation that looked into how much Constellation was really going to cost. How much would this program cost? And, well, the result was, well, we know the shuttle's going away. It's going to stop flying. And it turns out that Constellation really isn't affordable. You actually cannot do Constellation plus space station plus retiring the shuttle on the sort of budgets NASA gets. So Constellation got canceled. So here we are in 2010. We're a year away from shuttle retiring. And not only do we not have a solution to launch astronauts, we don't even have a plan for a solution. So at that point, Congress stepped in, and they directed NASA to build something they called a Space Launch System. And here's the actual verbiage. The important part is a fully integrated vehicle capable of carrying a total payload of 130 tons or more into low Earth orbit in preparation for missions beyond low Earth orbit. That's a really big rocket. So the Saturn V that was used on Apollo could lift about 140 tons to low Earth orbit. So same class here. And they also said, make it a goal to achieve full operational capability by the end of 2016. So this is a pretty challenging thing to do. So what did NASA do? Well, the NASA administrator, Bolden, decided to do something kind of different. He set up a competition, and NASA organized 3 teams, and 3 teams would come up with their best designs in a specific area. So here's the kind of rocket we think your team should concentrate on, go off, look at a bunch of different options, and figure out what you might be able to create. So there's a team called Rack 1. They would look at liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen designs. You can think of this as shuttle-derived designs. That's really what it ended up being. Rack 2 would look at liquid oxygen, RP1, rocket propellant 1, or kerosene designs. And Rack 3, well, this is kind of a weird one. They would essentially look at existing expendable launchers like the Atlas V and the Delta and figure out if you could meet the requirements by putting them together. And I'm not really going to talk about Rack 3 very much. And so all those groups went off. They spent quite a bit of time coming back, looking at different options. They came back with a report, and that got put into a summary report so NASA could decide what their next steps were going to be. And this is a page from that report. And you can see on the left, liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. We have shuttle-derived designs, liquid oxygen RP1 in the middle, and then on the right, modular with something wrong with the rendering. Sorry about that. I'm not really going to talk about modular anymore. We're going to focus on the liquid oxygen RP1 versions. And before I talk about the different concepts that the team came up with, I need to digress a little bit into talking about propellants. And different rocket propellants are measured by a measure called specific impulse, which is roughly a measure of how much thrust you get per unit of mass. So I have a kilogram of the propellant and I burn it in the rocket engine. How much thrust do I get out? You can think of it, it's a little like fuel mileage for a car. Similar to that. Different propellants give different values. Simply the chemistry is different between different propellants. So an engine like the RS-25, which was used on the space shuttle, it uses liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. It has a specific impulse of 366. To compare that with a similar engine, there's an RD-180, which is similar design-wise to the space shuttle main engine. It uses liquid oxygen and RP1. It has a specific impulse of 311. So you look at those two numbers and you say, well, 366 is better than 311, so we should always choose that. But there's a really important caveat here. Liquid hydrogen is about 1/10 of the density of RP1. So what that means is to have a similar mass of liquid hydrogen, you need a tank that's 10 times as big, has 10 times the volume. Now, if you factor in the differences in specific impulse and the fact that you're not just running liquid hydrogen or RP1, you also have to carry liquid oxygen. You run through all the numbers and you kind of look at this. There's a measure you come up with called density impulse, which kind of takes the specific impulse and factors in how dense the propellants are. And you find that liquid oxygen RP1 has roughly double the density impulse of liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. So that means all other things being equal, a first stage using liquid hydrogen would be about double the size in volume of a first stage using RP1. So it's especially important for first stage because that's where the tanks are the biggest. So, and that means, a bigger tank can be problematic not only in building it and having it be heavy, but you may not actually be able to ship it in places where you want to. This is one of the reasons why, if you look at the current liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen designs, most of them have solid rocket boosters on the sides. And that's because building a tank that's big enough here is actually a supreme challenge. For upper stages, specific impulse is more important than density impulse. So upper stages, liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tends to be a better choice. So this team, they're looking at liquid oxygen and RP1, and they have to figure out what engines they're going to use. And this may seem kind of backwards, but rather than building a rocket and looking for engines, generally you look at engines first to kind of figure out what rocket you could build. And it's around engines you can either have, or maybe you think you can develop, or ones you're going to build from scratch. So the LOX RP1 team looked at 3 different engine choices. And the first one they called 2 Mlbf GG. Okay, so what does that mean? 2 Mlbf means an engine that produces 2 million pounds of thrust. That would be a very big liquid rocket engine. It would in fact be the biggest liquid rocket engine ever built. GG. GG means gas generator. And just like there are different engine types in cars, there are different engine types for rockets. And they are different difficulty to build and slightly different efficiency. So you can think of a gas generator. This is a simple design. It's a well understood design. It's not as efficient as some of the other designs. So you're trading off simple and well understood for efficient. Now, the report that talks about all of these never mentions an engine that they were thinking about when they were talking about this specific engine. But it's really, really obvious there's only one engine candidate here that could even come close. And that's the F1 engine that was used in the first stage of the Saturn V. And the F1 engine produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. So, okay, it's in the right ballpark. It is a gas generator engine. So, big gas generator engine is going to be an F1. Now, the problem is it's not quite big enough. So, how would we deal with that? How would we get that to be more thrust? Well, it turns out in the late 1960s, while the Apollo program was running, the manufacturers actually did a version of this engine called the F1A. And it was uprated to 1.8 million pounds of thrust, which is getting pretty close to 2 million. Now, the problematic thing, of course, is that was the late 1960s, and we're now 40 or 50 years later. And we don't build engines the same way, and this turns out to be have been a fairly expensive engine to build, even though it was a simple design. So we can't just say, hey, let's just build these. We'd have to come up with a new way of doing that. And how would we do that? So interestingly, a few years after this report was, there was an approach to figure out what NASA was going to do for SLS Block 2, for the version they actually chose. And Block 2 required high-performance side boosters. And one of the companies that bid on them said they were going to take the F1 engine and do a new version. So we actually have a pretty good idea from what they said they were going to do, what the team might have been thinking about. And this was going to be a version known as the F1B. It's expected to generate 1.8 million pounds of thrust like the F1A, but be much cheaper and easier to build. And if we look at the diagram on the left, you'll see it says simplified F1A turbopump assembly. So you're essentially taking the F1A, you're taking some other stuff from the F1, you're changing the main combustion chamber, how you build that, you're changing the nozzle, how you build that, and then you're changing kind of the ducting. So if you know anything about SpaceX, you know they have a Merlin engine that is also a RP1 gas generator. And it kind of looks like this. It's much, much smaller in terms of thrust. But kind of conceptually, it's a similar sort of thing. So this is pretty much very likely what the team was thinking about. However, it's still not 2 million pounds of thrust. And it's not really clear to me what the team was thinking. I can see a couple options. It could be that they were thinking of something like this, but uprated further. To me, that seems like a needless expense. We know that the Saturn V on the original F1 could lift 140 tons to LEO, which is bigger than the 130 that they were trying to do. We also know that the F1A, or this engine, was 20% more powerful than that. So clearly, if you build something like that with either the F1A or the F1B, you're going to be able to do 140 tons to LEO. So I'm not sure why you would try to go to 2 million pounds. And it could be that they weren't actually trying, and they were just kind of ballparking. And of course, this engine would have been cheaper than the 2 million pound version. It could be just that it's a rounding error, and they were just talking about an engine like an F1B. But, and I haven't found anything that tells me one way or the other, any documentation. So that's kind of a mystery. The second engine they looked at is an engine called the RD-180. And most of the US development went towards high efficiency, what are called stage combustion, liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen engines. Now, stage combustion engines are much more efficient than gas generator engines, but there was believed, at least to be in the US, there was believed to be a problem with building a stage combustion LOX RP1 engine. And the problem is that such an engine has to deal with high temperature, high pressure oxygen. And high temperature, high pressure oxygen is really hard to deal with in the presence of metals. So you need to build your engine out of metal, you have high temperature oxygen around, it's going to want to erode away. And there was a belief, at least in some places, that you really couldn't build one of these. So the US focused on the liquid hydrogen ones, where you don't actually have this issue because you're not dealing with hot oxygen. It turns out the Russians disagreed. And they went off and they built such an engine. In fact, they built a whole series of these engines. And the one that this group looked at is an RD-180. It's a kind of a weird engine in that it has a single turbopump, but it has two combustion chambers. So on the right, it looks like it's two engines, but it's really only one engine with two nozzles, two combustion chambers. And this is kind of curious. On the other side, you notice in the background there's a label that says there's a final assembly, and that's in English. And this is in fact an Atlas V rocket with a Russian RD-180 engine on it. And the Atlas V, they've been flying with a single RD-180 engine since 2002, and supposedly this engine costs them about $10 million each, which is really cheap for a high efficiency engine like this. Unfortunately, if we look at the thrust, it's about 0.8 of a million pounds of thrust. So it's a lot less than the F1B. And if you're kind of comparing an engine design with 5 F1Bs, and you want to use the RD-180, you need 11 of them. And that's not really tenable. They did do some designs. I show one on the left that had 7 RD-180 engines. If you look at the bottom, you can see there's just a whole bunch of nozzles there. But they couldn't really get it up to the payload range they wanted just because they don't have quite enough thrust. So, nice engine. This really wasn't an option that seemed viable for them. Option 3 was what I'm calling a mystery engine. And this is a 1.25 million pounds of thrust, ORSC, oxygen-rich stage combustion, or essentially like the RD-180 I just talked about, but with more thrust. The Air Force really wanted this engine as a replacement for the RD-180. And the reason they wanted it as a replacement is the Atlas V launches a lot of Department of Defense classified satellites. And having one of your main launchers for those satellites depend on an engine made by another country seems like not a great position to be in. So the Air Force wanted an engine that they could use instead of the RD-180 in the Atlas V, or maybe in a new rocket. In response to this, there have been a couple engines, a couple designs that were talked about that might have ended up in this area. There's the RS-84 and the TR-107. Both of these are possible engines. You notice they're actually drawings on the left and not actually pictures. I don't think we got into full production or full development of these engines, but they were certainly possible. They are a little less than 1.25 million pounds of thrust. And this may be like the F1, that the team was just basically using a ballpark figure, rather than looking at actual engines. The problem with these engines was that when you got to heavy lift, you required either 3 stages or strap-on boosters. They could do the medium stuff, but when they wanted to go with really high payloads, you needed to go with those options. And that's problematic from a development perspective. If you have to build a 3rd stage, that's another stage you're building. So another contract, much more complexity. And similarly, if you add strap-on boosters, that's like a whole new launcher. And you have to do everything, all the design for that, and then it makes staging harder. So it's just a little more complicated. The team liked this approach, but when they looked through how it ranked based upon the big one, the 2 million one, it just didn't rank quite as well. So they went through and they finally settled on what they called a fixed frame approach. And they're going to use the 2 million pound-foot gas generator engine, the F1 engine, and they're going to build a single tank set. And by that they mean we're going to build a first stage of a given size, and we're going to build a second stage of a given size. And then we're going to play around with performance by using different numbers of engines. And they give some dimensions, and they give us this very nice chart, very nice slide that shows some of the different options. So, and we can see if we look at the diagrams on the right, we can see that we have a vehicle called 4.2. It has 4 F1 derived engines, the first stage, and then it has 2 J2 derived engines. Now, not coincidentally, The F1 engine was the first stage engine on the Saturn V. The J2 engine was the second stage engine on the Saturn V. So we're essentially taking a Saturn V and upgrading both of the engines. And then they had options all the way up to 7 F1 engines in the first stage and 5 J2 engines in the second stage. And you can obviously figure out that's going to be quite a heavy lifter. And very nicely on the left side, they gave us this nice drawing that showed us kind of what they were thinking of in size. So size of the first stage, size of the second stage, and then we had payload on top. They also tell us that they're thinking about a 33-foot diameter. And 33-foot diameter also is the diameter used by the Saturn V. So it turns out if you kind of put these two rockets next to each other, guess what? They look very much alike. And the scaling was done pretty quickly, so I think it's probably not perfect, but it gives you a basic idea. And basically what we have with this new rocket is it's like a Saturn V, but the first stage is longer and the second stage is longer. And that's kind of where they ended up. So that's the rocket that they're proposing. And then we have the other rockets by the other teams. And so what happened? So that came back, that went into a document, and then a group got together and looked at the various designs and tried to summarize the pros and the cons for each approach. So I'm going to talk about Team 2, pros and cons first. And they said the large RP rocket consistently ranks as the most capable long-term solution. High margins, simpler operations, greater cost incentives due to competition in designing from a clean sheet. That's a really important statement. They just think this is a superior because of this. Now, in this case, margins doesn't mean monetary. Margins means kind of from a performance perspective. Because of the design they're using, they think not only will this rocket do what they need, it has enough extra performance that we are very confident that we can get the performance we need, even if we have some weight issues or some other issues. They also said high top-end performance, easily attained for any future mission. So I think that is relation to the option of adding more engines and actually getting higher performance. Best LOC LOM due to engine out capability. So this is pretty simple. LOM means loss of mission, and LOC means loss of crew. And basically what this is saying is if you have multiple engines and you have one that breaks, you have a better chance of being able to complete the mission and not kill the crew because of that. Generally, you can just run the other engines longer. So that tends to be better than the what they saw for the other teams. Negative attributes: high peak development cost of new propulsion and delayed flight schedule. What they're basically saying here is that because we are developing new engines, or at least upgrading existing engines, we are going to have to put a lot of money in development to get those up and running. So that means at the beginning of the program, we're going to see this big spike as we're spending all that money. And once we've done that development, then it'll come back down. And this is what most technical development programs look like. If you go back and you look at Apollo, at NASA spending over the years, it looks like this. There's a big spike and then it comes back down. Unfortunately, that's not the way Congress gives money to NASA. Congress tends to give NASA a very steady budget of a fixed amount year after year after year after year, which means you can't really absorb these big spikes within a fixed budget unless you take money from somewhere else, and that's pretty disruptive. So NASA has this ongoing problem across all of their programs of how do we take these spikes and de-spike them or spread it out. What that means is if you have a big spike inherently, you're going to have to spread it out. It's going to take longer. So that's what they're saying here. The second con is that they said it required a unique size-driven infrastructure for new LOCs and RP. And to do this, I need to kind of go back to the Apollo era. So this is a diagram of pad 39A and how the propellant systems worked for Apollo, for the Saturn V. And the Saturn V had 3 different propellants. They had liquid oxygen. So they had space for that on the right, storage, and then lines to take that to the pad. On the lower left, they had liquid hydrogen. They had to store that and send that into the pad. And then they also had RP1, store it in a pipeline to send it in. So all 3 of these were up and operational for Apollo. But then Shuttle came in, and Shuttle didn't use RP1. So NASA just essentially abandoned that part of the infrastructure. And the fact is, the launch site is in Florida. It's very moist, it's very salty, and 40 years or 50 years of that doesn't do nice things to infrastructure. So you can see this is a picture of purportedly the RP1 line at one of the pads, and you can see that not only the supports just all rusted and messed up, the pipeline is just missing in places. So it's just broken and fallen apart. And so it's definitely true that if you're doing something at pad 39A or 39B, you're going to have to go through and redo the RP1 stuff if you're going to use RP1. But it turns out that SpaceX has leased pad 39A, and their Falcon rocket uses RP1 and liquid oxygen. So they had to go through and do this. And it apparently didn't turn out to be a significant problem for them to either refurbish or replace all of the RP1 infrastructure. So I find it a little strange that kind of this level of thing made it to the cons, but that's what they're talking about there. So that was Team 2. Let's flip over and talk about Team 1, the shuttle-derived one. And they said, shuttle-derived architecture consistently provides a really highly capable solution. And they gave 2 subpoints. And the first is existing assets provide a fast, low-cost start flight test. What they mean is existing assets is existing shuttle hardware. So they have shuttle engines that are left over from the shuttle program, and they can easily get solid rocket boosters made. And that means you can take those assets, you can put them together, and you can fly pretty quickly. Unfortunately, you notice it says start flight test. It lets you fly pretty quickly, but you're not actually flying the vehicle that you're hoping to fly in the future. You're just flying an earlier version. Similarly, acquisition options provide a fast start. And that just means you either have existing shuttle contractors or you have contractors that are working on Constellation. We're working on Constellation. They already know how to build these things. You already have contracts with some of them. You can just kind of roll those over and it'll be smooth and it'll be quick. On the negative sides, they say, like on the RP1, the negative attributes of shuttle-derived remain. High propulsion systems, production and op costs due to complex reusable systems and infrastructure designed for higher launch rates than projected for SLS. So it's really talking about 2 separate things. The complex reusable systems is likely a reference to the shuttle main engine. So the RS-25 is a wonderful main engine. It worked very well and was very reliable during shuttle. Most of the engines flew 10 or 15 times. So it's also a very, very high performance engine. That's also good. The unfortunate thing is it is a very, very expensive engine. And now you're taking this very expensive engine that you used to fly 14 times and you're going to fly it once. And you actually need 4 of them rather than the 3 you had on the shuttle. So it means you're taking this engine that is kind of designed for a different use, and it's going to be very expensive in this use. The infrastructure designed for higher launch rates. If you look back at what shuttle flew, they were flying anywhere 8, 7, 6, maybe down to 4 flights a year. If they're flying 4 flights, that meant they needed 8 solid rocket boosters, which meant the company that is building the solid rocket boosters has infrastructure that allows them to do 8 of them in a year, or more. Maybe they could do 16 in the earlier years. So given size production production line, a given size facility people, all of that is set up for this specific launch rate. SLS at the time was only projected to launch twice a year, and now it's only projected to launch once a year. And clearly, if you're going to take infrastructure that was designed to build 16 solid rockets boosters in a year, and you're only going to build 2, that's going to be problematic. It's just going to be much more expensive on a per booster basis. Low incentive to change the proven but high cost approach. So the reality is that all of these instructors, all of these contractors that are working on shuttle have existing designs and they have everything set up, and they really are not going to want to change it to be cheaper, because that's a lot of work, it's putting money in, and it's really probably not in their best interest. So you don't have incentives trying to push them to be cheaper, which is kind of the opposite of what they said for the RP1 approach. So at this point, we look at these, and I think the set of evaluations on both teams are actually pretty fair. You look at them and it's all about the technical part, about the what we're doing. It's like, okay, do we get the payload we're wanting? How long is it going to take? How much budget is going to take? All the things that you'd expect NASA to be caring about. Oh, so I got ahead of myself. So the other negative part is the block development approach to attain high-end performance for future missions results in higher cost. So basically what that's saying is, yes, you're building stuff and you're flying it early, but it's not the version that's actually going to get you 130 tons. So you're going to build that version, the first version, then you're going to build a second version, and it's not until you get to the third version that you actually get the performance that you want. And not only does that result in a higher cost, you're building some parts over again. It's just a lot more complicated. So, as I said, all of those look like reasonable things, but there's one more that showed up on the evaluation here, on the positive side. And it said, this shuttle-derived version is the only option that maintains U.S. lead in technology and skill base for large liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, and large solid rockets. And this is kind of a confusing thing to see. It's really not like anything else. So all the other things are about how each system relates to being able to accomplish the goal. But this is about technology and skill base. And that's really not related to the actual goal. So the question is, why is this in here? Where does this come from? And to do that, we need to go back and look at the appropriations bill that set up SLS. And there are two really interesting clauses in here. The first one says NASA needs to ensure the retention, modification, and development of critical skills and capabilities as appropriate in areas related to solid and liquid engines, large diameter fuel tanks, rocket propulsion, and other ground test capabilities. So those are specific, the kinds of things that were listed in that advantage for the shuttle-derived systems. So basically that's saying Congress told us that we needed to try to keep our technological lead in all of these areas, and shuttle-derived is the only one that gives us that. Further, there's another clause. It requires the administrator to utilize existing contracts, investment, workforce, industrial base, and capabilities from the Space Shuttle and the Orion and Ares 1 projects, which are constellation projects, and shuttle-derived and Ares 1 components that use existing U.S. propulsion systems. So we basically put these two together. It says you need to make sure to retain the skills and capabilities in things that were used to build shuttle, and you need to utilize existing contracts, which all would have been constellation related to shuttle, investments, workforce, and anything. So this is largely viewed as the Senate saying you can build whatever, the Congress saying you can build whatever rocket you want as long as it's shuttle derived. Now, it's not actually clear what actually happened in NASA and how they actually viewed things. Now, I can think of, three obvious cases. There's the case where they looked at everything and they thought the shuttle drive design was superior. And this really didn't matter. It just happened to be, it was there, but they didn't really care about it. I don't think the reading of the pros and cons of the two systems really supports that. The second option is that they considered the two options about similar, and that this kind of pushed them towards shuttle. I think that's possible. I don't think it fits my reading of what I read there, but I think it's possible. And of course, the third option is that the liquid oxygen RP-1 Saturn V style rocket was superior, and the big reason that they chose shuttle derived was because of this. And I think that is actually the reality of what happened, that NASA would have preferred the Saturn V version, and they kind of felt like they had to choose this version because of the direction they got from Congress. And if you look back and look at some of the issues that have come up with SLS since the program started, the cons listed for that approach seem pretty prescient. It seems like, NASA, it's not like they didn't expect to have some of the problems that they had. So we didn't get the big one. We didn't get the big Saturn V. We ended up getting this series. And this is the SLS series. We had Block 1 on the left, then we have Block 1B kind of in the middle, and then Block 2 on the right. Block 2, it's pretty clear that Block 1 does not meet the 130 tons to LEO. Block 1B might, and Block 2 would. All we have so far is Block 1, and Block 1 a few years off, maybe. Block 1B, the only difference is a different upper stage, so maybe Block 1B happens. It seems really unlikely that Block 2 will ever happen. So, kind of just a little bit of history, maybe some alternate history that could have happened if things kind of dropped a different way. So, thanks for your attention. I'm going to put a few references in the description for this. If you want to go off and read the NASA reports that I've found and kind of make your own opinion, make your own decision, feel free.